Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that history almost feels embarrassed to admit. Not a battlefield, not a palace balcony, not even a confession booth. A courtroom, and in the middle of it, a throne. But the one sitting on it cannot breathe, cannot blink, cannot deny anything, because the one being judged is already dead. It is the year 897. Rome is not the marble postcard people imagine. Rome is a tense, hungry city where power changes hands quickly, where families keep ledgers of grudges, and where the sacred office of the Pope is tangled in something very human: fear. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the air is heavy, not only with incense, but with the sour knowledge that something is wrong. A body has been brought in, not carried gently like a saint, not honored like a shepherd who has finished his work. This one has been pulled up from the ground. The corpse is dressed in pontifical robes, arranged with a kind of grim care, as if clothing can restore dignity to what time has already taken. The remains are propped up, set in place, made to sit like a living man. And around him stand clergy, officials, and witnesses who know that this scene should not exist. The dead man is Pope Formosus, and the one presiding over this tribunal is Pope Stephen VI. The name we give to this event later on is the Cadaver Synod, a phrase that sounds like a legend someone made up to frighten children. But it happened. And to understand it, we have to stop thinking of Rome as calm and holy and start seeing it as it often was: a city with sacred language on its lips and knives hidden under its sleeves. Because this trial is not really a trial. It is a message. It is power trying to overwrite memory. In Rome, legitimacy is not only claimed, sometimes it is performed. Sometimes it is staged so loudly, so publicly, that the crowd is forced to accept the new version of reality, simply because everyone else is watching too. So Stephen VI stands before the corpse and speaks as if the dead pope can answer. He lists accusations. He condemns Formosus for breaking canon law, for holding office improperly, for perjury, for violating rules that, in calmer times, might have been handled with paperwork and debate. But this is not about paperwork. This is about vengeance. Because Formosus, while alive, had become woven into the rivalries of powerful Roman factions and foreign kings. He had made alliances that angered the wrong people. And when he died, those people did what ruthless systems often do. They decided even death would not protect him. Stephen VI did not act alone. A pope in this period is rarely a solitary ruler. He sits on a throne, yes, but the throne is surrounded by patrons, families, armed men, and pressure. And there is something else here too: fear of the future. Because if Formosus's decisions are allowed to stand, then the people who lost under him might lose again. But if his decisions can be declared invalid, if his acts can be erased, then the world can be reset. That's the real purpose of putting a corpse on trial. Not justice, undoing. So the basilica becomes a theater. A deacon is appointed to speak for the dead pope, because even this nightmare wants to pretend it is lawful. A defense must exist, even if it is only a shadow. And imagine what it feels like to be that deacon. To stand there, speaking words into a silence that isn't respectful silence, but the silence of decay. To argue for a man who cannot nod, cannot lift a hand, cannot even look at you. Stephen VI does not need to be convinced. The outcome is already chosen. The sentence is delivered. And then comes the part that has lived in memory like a stain. The sacred garments are torn away. The body is handled with contempt, and 2 fingers are cut off, the fingers used for blessing. There is symbolism in that act that is hard to miss. A blessing is not only kindness. A blessing is authority expressed through the body. Those fingers say, "This man could speak for God." Stephen's message is, "No, he could not." It is a kind of ritual amputation, not of flesh alone, but of legitimacy. And then, as if the earth itself is unwilling to keep this man, the corpse is thrown into the Tiber River. Not buried with honor, not laid to rest, disposed of like evidence. Now, it's easy to hear this and think, surely Rome would refuse to accept it. But crowds do not always resist immediately. Sometimes people freeze. Sometimes the shock is so complete that the moment passes before the mind can catch it. And in that basilica, there are onlookers, clergy, officials, ordinary citizens who know they are witnessing something profane, but they also know that power is watching them back. So they do what people often do when they are trapped between disgust and danger. They stay still. They watch. They tell themselves they will understand later. But later does come. And later is angry, because the cadaver synod does not land as a clever political maneuver. It lands as a spiritual horror. The papal office, whatever people think of the man holding it, is supposed to carry gravity, restraint, a sense that the sacred cannot be used as a tool for petty revenge. And Stephen VI has shattered that illusion in public. The ordinary people of Rome, who may not know the details of imperial alliances or aristocratic feuds, understand something simpler. A pope has just mocked the dead. And that tells them that nothing is safe, not law, not faith, not even the grave. So the city begins to turn. Whispers first, then arguments in marketplaces, then the kind of street talk that grows sharp enough to cut, and eventually the anger becomes movement. In the summer of 897, Stephen VI is overthrown. He is arrested, thrown into prison, and strangled. It is a violent end, and it is fitting in the bleak logic of Rome at the time. The man who dragged a dead pope into judgment is himself judged by the living city. After Stephen's fall, the church moves quickly to clean the wound. Because institutions understand something about survival, you cannot let the public believe the sacred has turned into a circus. So the next pope, Theodore II, ruling briefly, orders that Formosis's body be retrieved from the river and reburied with honor. Then, John IX holds synods that overturn the cadaver synod and forbid future trials of corpses. It is an official attempt to say, this was not us. But history does not forget so easily, because what happened in 897 is not just one grotesque moment, it is a symptom. It reveals that the papacy, at its worst, could be pulled into factional warfare like any other throne. That holiness could be spoken of while cruelty was practiced. That the title Vicar of Christ did not automatically prevent a man from acting like an instrument of revenge. And that raises the quiet question that will haunt the rest of our journey tonight. If the office can be used this way once, what else has been done under its name? Because the cadaver synod is not the end of the darkness. It is the door opening. And beyond that door, Rome enters centuries where noble families treat the papal throne like property, where reform fights corruption like a small lamp in a windy room, where scandal becomes weapon and morality becomes propaganda. But before we walk further, let's stay for one last moment inside that basilica. Picture the throne. Picture the corpse. Picture the living pope shouting accusations at a man who cannot answer. And imagine the ordinary believer standing in the crowd. Not a noble, not a bishop, just a person who came to church expecting prayers and found a trial for the dead. That feeling, confusion turning into dread, is the beginning of everything. Because once people see that the highest spiritual office can be used for revenge, they start wondering which parts of the world are sacred and which parts are simply controlled. And that is where our story truly begins. Formosus, the Pope Rome needed to hate. If you were an ordinary Roman in the late 9th century, you would not have spoken the name Formosus lightly, not because he was feared, but because every powerful family seemed to tell a different story about him. To some, he was a capable churchman. To others, a dangerous political schemer. And to the men who ruled Rome behind the scenes, he was something far worse, a problem that refused to stay buried. To understand why a pope's corpse was dragged from its grave, we have to slow down and ask a quieter question. Not what Formosus did, but who he threatened by doing it. Formosus did not rise in a vacuum. He came from a Rome that was already fractured, caught between local aristocratic clans, rival Italian princes, and the looming presence of Frankish kings who believed the papacy should serve imperial ambitions. In this world, the Pope was not just a spiritual shepherd, he was a prize. Control the Pope, and you controlled legitimacy. Lose the Pope, and your enemies gained a holy stamp for their claims. Formosus had been Bishop of Porto before becoming Pope. He was intelligent, politically aware, and, most importantly, willing to look beyond Rome's internal factions when seeking support. That alone made him dangerous. Rome's most powerful families did not like popes who built alliances elsewhere. They preferred weak men, or predictable men, or men who owed them everything. Formosus owed them very little. During his earlier career, he had supported Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish ruler with ambitions in Italy. This put him directly at odds with the House of Spoleto, one of the most aggressive and entrenched powers in Rome. The Spoletans wanted their own candidates elevated, their own influence preserved, their own vision of Italy protected. Formosus stood in the way, and in medieval politics, standing in the way rarely ended well. When Formosus became pope in 891, his position was already unstable. He was surrounded by men who smiled politely while keeping lists of grievances. Every decision he made, every alliance, every letter sent north of the Alps was carefully noted. His papacy was not especially long, and it was not especially peaceful. He maneuvered between powers, trying to keep Rome from becoming a puppet of any single faction. But in doing so, he made enemies on all sides. When Formosus died in 896, there was no public outrage, no immediate reckoning, no riots. And that is important, because it tells us something about Rome at the time. The city was tired, used to instability, accustomed to waiting before reacting. Formosus was buried quietly, but his decisions were still alive. Appointments he had made were still valid. Alliances he had forged still mattered. Clergy he had ordained still held office. And for the men who lost under Formosus, that was unacceptable. So they waited. And then came Stephen VI. Stephen was not a strong pope. not in the way later popes would be. He did not stride into office with an independent power base or a reformist vision. He was elevated because he was useful. His patrons, particularly those aligned with the House of Spoleto, saw in him an opportunity, not to govern the future, but to rewrite the past. Because here is a quiet truth of medieval power. If you can discredit a ruler after death, you can erase their legacy without fighting their supporters directly. That is what the Cadaver Synod was designed to do. Formosus was accused of violating canon law by holding multiple offices improperly. But these charges were not new discoveries. They were known while he was alive. They had been tolerated, overlooked, politely ignored. Only after his death did they suddenly become unforgivable crimes. That tells us everything. The trial was not about morality. It was about nullification. If Formosus could be declared illegitimate, then everything he touched could be undone. Clergy he ordained could be stripped of authority. Decisions he made could be reversed. Opponents he empowered could be pushed aside. It was legal theater, performed with religious language to achieve political ends. And the choice to make it public, to stage it inside the Lateran Basilica, was deliberate. This was not meant to be a quiet correction. It was meant to be seen. Because in Rome, legitimacy lived in the eyes of the people. The crowd mattered. The spectacle mattered. Stephen VI was not only condemning a dead pope, he was instructing the city on how to remember him. Formosus was not to be recalled as a flawed leader in a dangerous time. He was to be remembered as a criminal, a usurper, a violator of sacred order. And yet, something went wrong. The people did not respond the way the planners expected. Yes, they watched. Yes, they endured the spectacle. But instead of absorbing the lesson, many recoiled from it. Because medieval Romans understood power games. They lived with them daily, but there were lines that, once crossed, unsettled even a hardened city. Digging up a pope crossed that line. The trial did not make Formosus look weak. It made Stephen look unhinged. It made the papacy look fragile. And it made the invisible machinery of control suddenly visible. In taverns and marketplaces, people began to talk. Not about Formosus's alleged crimes, but about Stephen's behavior, about the shouting, about the mutilation, about the river. They did not need theology to understand what had happened. They understood instinctively that if a pope could do this to another pope, then the office itself had lost something essential: respect. And respect, once cracked, is hard to repair. When Stephen VI fell soon after, the reversal was swift. Synods were convened, decrees issued. The Cadaver Synod was declared invalid. Future trials of corpses were banned. Officially, the Church declared, this must never happen again. But unofficially, something else lingered. A realization that the papacy, for all its sacred language, could be dragged into the same cycles of revenge and manipulation as any secular throne. Formosus, in death, became more powerful than he had been alive, because his humiliation exposed the system. He became a symbol, not of corruption, but of how easily accusations could be manufactured after the fact. And that lesson would echo through the centuries. Because the men who followed, John XII, Benedict IX, the Borgias, and others, would live in a world where legitimacy was constantly contested, constantly rewritten, constantly under threat. Formosus was not the most evil pope. He may not even have been a bad one. But he was the one Rome decided it needed to destroy, publicly, theatrically, and permanently. And in trying to erase him, Rome accidentally revealed something far more dangerous, that the throne of Peter could be used as a weapon. And once that truth was visible, it could never be unseen. In the next part, we move forward into the era where this realization becomes routine, where noble families stop pretending and the papacy itself becomes a hereditary prize. An age later remembered by a single, uncomfortable word: pornocracy. Stephen VI, when vengeance became doctrine. Stephen VI did not enter history intending to be remembered. That may sound strange, given what he would later do. But not every destructive figure begins with ambition. Some begin with weakness. Stephen was elevated to the papal throne in a Rome already trembling with unresolved grudges. The city had not healed from Formosus's reign. It had merely paused, and when power pauses without resolution, it gathers pressure. Stephen was not a towering personality. He did not command loyalty through charisma or vision. What he had instead was something far more dangerous in unstable systems: dependence. He depended on those who had raised him. And those men wanted revenge. In late 9th century Rome, the papacy was not an independent monarchy. It was an office embedded in a dense web of aristocratic families, armed retainers, and external kings who believed Rome should bend to their interests. A pope who tried to stand alone rarely lasted long. Stephen knew this. He had been bishop of Anagni under Formosus. His elevation to the papacy was not a popular demand or a reformist uprising. It was a calculated appointment, shaped by the very factions that had suffered under Formosus's alliances. When Stephen took the throne, he inherited more than robes and rituals. He inherited expectations. The House of Spoleto and its allies did not want governance. They wanted erasure. They wanted the previous pope humiliated so thoroughly that no one would dare defend his legacy again. And Stephen agreed. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or personal bitterness, Stephen allowed vengeance to become policy. This is where the Cadaver Synod stops being grotesque spectacle and becomes something more unsettling. A lesson in how institutions justify cruelty once it is dressed in legal language. The trial of Formosus was framed as a defense of canon law. Stephen presented himself not as an avenger, but as a guardian of order. He spoke of violations, of illegal consecrations, of broken rules that demanded correction. But canon law had existed long before Stephen, and it had never demanded this. Stephen did not discover a hidden crime. He resurrected old accusations because they served the moment. This is a pattern that appears again and again in corrupt systems. Laws become tools, not standards. They are invoked loudly when convenient and forgotten when inconvenient. Stephen's behavior during the trial reveals this clearly. He did not deliberate. He did not listen. He did not hesitate. The shouting described by chroniclers was not theatrical excess. It was intimidation. It was a signal to the living clergy watching that silence was safer than sympathy. And when the corpse was mutilated, that signal became unmistakable. The cutting of the fingers was not random cruelty. It was a declaration that Formosus's blessings were void, that his authority had never existed, that anyone who benefited from it stood on unstable ground. Stephen was rewriting reality by force. But here is the irony. The very extremity of the act exposed Stephen's insecurity. Strong rulers do not need spectacles like this. They rule quietly, efficiently, and with minimal disturbance. Spectacle is the weapon of those who fear dissent, and dissent came quickly, not from foreign kings, not from distant bishops, but from the streets of Rome. The ordinary people who rarely influenced papal politics directly, understood something vital. If the Pope could dig up another pope and treat him like refuse, then the office itself had lost its moral center. Stephen's defenders likely believed the outrage would fade, that the people would accept the narrative once it was officially declared. They misjudged the moment. Rome was accustomed to violence, but sacrilege struck deeper. Medieval faith was not abstract, it was tactile. People touched relics, kissed icons, trusted blessings to protect their families. The Pope was not merely an administrator, he was a living symbol of continuity with the divine. By abusing a dead pope, Stephen had disrupted that continuity. Suddenly, the papacy looked less like a sacred office and more like a stage where the powerful settled scores. Anger simmered. And when it erupted, it did so with the same brutality Stephen himself had displayed. In the summer of 897, Stephen VI was seized by a mob. The details of his fall are sparse, but the result is clear. He was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled. There is no trial recorded for Stephen, no ceremony, no ritual humiliation. Rome had learned something from him. It did not need spectacle anymore. His death closed the immediate crisis, but it did not heal the deeper wound. Because what Stephen VI proved was not that he was uniquely cruel. He proved that the papacy could be bent. He proved that spiritual authority could be weaponized in daylight before crowds without immediate collapse. That realization mattered far more than his short reign. After his fall, the Church rushed to repair the damage. Synods annulled his decisions. Formosus was reburied with honor. Rules were issued forbidding trials of the dead. But these were repairs to appearances, not to structures. The forces that had driven Stephen, dynastic ambition, aristocratic control, and political fear, remained firmly in place. And they were about to grow stronger. Because Stephen's failure did not discourage the powerful from interfering in the papacy. It taught them a lesson. It taught them that outrage could be survived if managed carefully, that even extreme acts could be reversed without permanent consequences, that Rome's memory, though sharp, could be redirected. The next generation would not repeat Stephen's mistake. They would not humiliate the dead. They would control the living, and that control would become systematic, hereditary, almost casual. The papacy would soon enter a phase where popes were installed not for holiness or learning, but because they were sons, nephews, or lovers of the right people. This is why historians later coined a word so uncomfortable that it still makes readers pause: pornocracy. The rule of women, they said. The rule of vice. The rule of households rather than councils. But beneath the insult lies a deeper truth. The papacy was no longer pretending to be independent. Stephen VI did not create this reality. He revealed it. He showed that when the sacred throne is captured by fear and revenge, it becomes capable of anything, even dragging the dead into judgment. And once that door is opened, history does not rush to close it. In the next part, we step fully into that era, where Rome's most powerful families stop hiding their influence, and where the papacy becomes an inheritance rather than a calling. An age where power sleeps in bedrooms, not monasteries. An age remembered quietly and bitterly as the pornocracy, the age of invisible queens. When later historians tried to name what came next, they chose a word that still feels sharp on the tongue: pornocracy. It is an ugly term, a deliberately insulting one. Translated loosely, it means the rule of harlots. And while the word itself tells us more about the biases of medieval chroniclers than about the full reality of the age, it does point towards something undeniably true. Power in Rome had moved out of public institutions and into private households. After the chaos of Stephen VI and the Cadaver Synod, the papacy did not collapse. It adapted. The throne of Peter remained. The rituals continued. The language of holiness endured. But behind the scenes, control shifted decisively, not to councils, not to reformers, but to families. Rome at the turn of the 10th century was no longer governed by theology. It was governed by bloodlines, marriage alliances, and the careful placement of relatives into strategic offices. And at the center of this web stood women who would never wear the tiara, but who decided who did. These women did not rule by decree. They ruled by access. One of them, more than any other, would become the symbol of the age, Marozia. To medieval moralists, Marozia was everything they feared. A woman who wielded influence without holding office, a figure whose power flowed through relationships rather than laws. Later chroniclers described her in lurid terms: seductress, corrupter, destroyer of the church. But those descriptions tell only part of the story. Because Marozia was not an anomaly. She was the product of a system that had learned from Stephen VI's failure. The lesson was simple. Public spectacle invites backlash. Private control does not. Marozia came from the powerful Theophylact family, one of Rome's most dominant aristocratic clans. Her father, Theophylact I, held military and administrative power. Her mother, Theodora, wielded influence through court networks that were both political and personal. Together, they understood something essential. If you could decide who became pope, you did not need to be pope. And so, the papacy became something like a hereditary office in practice, even if not in law. Popes were chosen because they were connected, because they were loyal, because they owed their position to the household that elevated them. Marozia herself was linked, by marriage, by rumor, and by political alliance, to multiple popes. One of them, Pope Sergius III, is often cited as her lover and the father of her son, who would later become Pope John XI. Whether that claim is biologically true is debated by modern historians. But politically, it does not matter. What matters is that contemporaries believed it, and belief is power. Under Marozia's influence, popes rose and fell not through councils or synods, but through palace intrigue. A pope who displeased the ruling family could be imprisoned, exiled, or quietly replaced. And unlike Stephen VI, this was done without grand gestures. No trials, no bodies. Just removal. For the ordinary people of Rome, this period was strangely quiet on the surface. There were no spectacles like the Cadaver Synod, no mobs tearing popes from thrones, but beneath that calm lay a deeper rot. Because legitimacy no longer flowed from holiness or learning. It flowed from proximity, from family dinners, from bedrooms, from whispered agreements made far from altars. This is why later reformers looked back on this age with such horror. Not because every pope was personally monstrous, but because the system itself had stopped pretending to be spiritual. The papacy became an extension of aristocratic power, and Marozia was simply the most visible architect of that transformation. Her rise did not go unchallenged. Rome was still a city of competing families, and power gained privately can be taken privately as well. Eventually, Marozia was overthrown, not by a council, but by her own son from a later marriage, Alberic II. He imprisoned her and ruled Rome directly, continuing the pattern she had perfected. The cycle did not end. It intensified. Under Alberic II, the papacy became even more tightly controlled. Popes were selected not for merit, but for obedience. They were placeholders, men who would not challenge the family that installed them. And this leads us directly to one of the most notorious figures of the age. A pope who did not just symbolize corruption, he lived it loudly. But before we meet him, it is worth pausing to understand why this system lasted as long as it did. Because it reveals something uncomfortable about institutions. Corruption does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like stability. During the pornocracy, Rome functioned. Markets opened, churches held services, rituals continued. The world did not end. But something essential had been hollowed out. Faith had become background noise to power. And when faith becomes ornamental, it stops restraining behavior. That is why the next pope would shock even a city accustomed to scandal. Because he would not merely be controlled by the system, he would exploit it. Openly, excessively, without apology. His name was John XII. He would ascend the papal throne not as a reluctant servant, but as a teenager raised to believe the office was his by right. And under him, the quiet corruption of the pornocracy would erupt into public disgrace. Dice on the altar, women in the Lateran, prayers neglected. All the things people whispered about Rome suddenly became impossible to deny. Marozia and her generation had proven that popes could be managed. John XII would prove something far worse. That when absolute power is inherited by someone without restraint, the damage does not stay hidden. In the next part, we meet the teenage pope who treated the papacy like a personal playground and forced even hardened churchmen to ask whether the institution could survive itself. The age of invisible queens is ending. The age of open decay is about to begin. John XII, a throne given too young. When Octavian of Tusculum became Pope John XII, Rome did not gasp at first. It sighed, because everyone understood what this meant. This was not an election in any meaningful sense. It was an inheritance. John XII was not chosen for wisdom, holiness, or experience. He was placed on the throne because his father, Alberic II, had ruled Rome with an iron grip and had forced the Roman nobility to swear an oath. When Alberic died, his son would become pope. And when Alberic died, that oath was honored. In 955, a boy, likely no more than 18 years old, was elevated to the highest spiritual office in Western Christendom. It is difficult to overstate how unprepared John XII was for this role. He had not risen through church offices. He had not been trained in pastoral care. He had not lived the slow, disciplined life that shaped most clerics. He had grown up inside a palace, surrounded by courtiers, soldiers, and privilege. To him, the papacy was not a burden. It was a possession. And once he realized that no one could easily remove him, restraint vanished. The Lateran Palace, the Pope's residence, became something Rome had never seen so openly before. Contemporary writers describe it as a place of constant feasting, gambling, and sexual encounters. Dice were rolled where prayers were meant to be said. Women came and went freely. Noblewomen, servants, and prostitutes were all said to have access to the papal chambers. One chronicler wrote, with barely concealed disgust, that the Lateran had been turned into a brothel. That phrase would echo through history. John XII did not even attempt to hide his behavior. He gambled openly. He drank heavily. He invoked pagan gods during games of chance, calling on Venus and Jupiter instead of saints. He neglected Mass. He treated church revenues as his personal treasury. And then there were the accusations: adultery, incest, simony, violence. Some of these claims likely grew in the retelling. Medieval polemic was not gentle. Enemies exaggerated freely. But even allowing for exaggeration, the core picture remains devastating. John XII did not respect the office he held. And the people who witnessed this were not only moral reformers. They were bishops, nobles, and foreign rulers, men accustomed to corruption, yet still stunned by the scale of his indifference. The most detailed account of John's crimes comes from Liutprand of Cremona, a bishop who attended the Synod of 963. His writings are hostile, yes, but they are also specific. John was accused of selling church offices, including ordaining a child, possibly as young as 10, as a bishop in exchange for money. He was accused of blinding and castrating enemies, of ordering murders, of setting fires. These are not vague moral complaints. They are allegations of criminal governance, and they mattered politically, because John XII did not rule in isolation. Italy was a chessboard of rival powers, and John needed military support. So he turned to Otto I of Germany, inviting him to Rome and crowning him Holy Roman Emperor in 962. It was a moment of immense symbolism: Pope and Emperor united. But John's loyalty did not last. Almost immediately, he began conspiring against Otto, negotiating with the emperor's enemies and undermining the alliance that had secured his position. When Otto discovered the betrayal, he did not respond with letters. He marched. The emperor returned to Rome with an army. John fled. And for the first time in centuries, a foreign ruler convened a synod to judge a sitting pope. The Synod of 963 is one of the most extraordinary moments in papal history. Bishops stood and listed John's crimes aloud. The charges were formal, recorded, and unprecedented in scope. John was deposed in absentia. A new pope, Leo VIII, was elected. For a moment, it seemed as if the system had corrected itself, but Rome was not finished. As soon as Otto left the city, John returned with armed supporters. He stormed the Lateran, expelled Leo VIII, and unleashed violent reprisals against his enemies. Clergy were beaten. Opponents were mutilated. The city descended into chaos. Within a single year, Rome saw multiple claimants to the papacy, shifting loyalties and constant fear. For ordinary Romans, this was not theological debate. It was survival. You woke up not knowing which pope ruled that morning, or whether the street outside would erupt into violence by evening. And then, abruptly, John XII died. In 964, at around 27 years old, his life ended as scandalously as it had been lived. The most popular account, widely believed though impossible to prove, says he was killed while in bed with a married woman, struck down by her husband. Another version claims he suffered a sudden stroke during adultery. Whether true or not, the story stuck. Because it felt fitting, even his enemies did not bother to soften it. John XII became a warning wrapped in rumor. To later reformers, he represented the absolute low point of inherited power. To contemporaries, he was proof that the papacy had become something dangerously unstable. And yet, this is crucial, John's fall did not immediately purify the church. It triggered control. Otto I decreed that future popes would require imperial approval. In other words, spiritual authority was now openly subordinate to secular power. The church had not reformed itself. It had been restrained. And restraint imposed from outside always comes at a cost. John XII did not destroy the papacy, but he shattered the illusion that it could regulate itself. He showed what happens when sacred authority is inherited without accountability. He forced the question that would haunt the Church for centuries: if the Pope can live like this, what exactly makes the office holy? In the next part, we meet the man who would take corruption even further, not through youthful excess, but through something colder and more calculating. A pope who would sell the papacy, then reclaim it, then lose it again. His name was Benedict IX, and his story reads less like tragedy and more like farce with blood on its hands. Benedict IX, when the papacy became property. By the time Benedict IX appeared on the stage, Rome no longer pretended to be surprised. Shock had been exhausted by John XII. Outrage had dulled, and cynicism had settled in like dust. So when a young man from the Tusculan dynasty was elevated to the papal throne in 1032, many Romans did not ask why. They asked how long. Benedict IX, born Theophylact of Tusculum, was the product of a system that had perfected itself. His family controlled Rome through money, armed retainers, and strategic marriages. They had placed popes before, and they intended to do so again. The papacy, in their hands, was no longer a calling. It was an asset. Benedict's exact age at his first accession is debated. Medieval sources, eager to emphasize scandal, claimed he was as young as 12. Modern historians are more cautious, placing him closer to 18 or 20. But the number matters less than the reality. He was too young, too unformed, too insulated. And he entered office believing the throne belonged to him. From the beginning, Benedict IX's reign felt unstable. Chroniclers describe him as violent, impulsive, and openly immoral. His conduct shocked even an age accustomed to excess. One contemporary, Pope Victor III, writing later, summed it up with chilling clarity. His life as pope was so vile, so foul, so execrable that I shudder to think of it. That is not reformist exaggeration. That is insider disgust. Rome under Benedict IX became dangerous, not metaphorically, literally. Opponents disappeared, rivals were attacked. The Lateran Palace echoed with intrigue and fear. Rumors spread of assaults, coercion, and killings carried out under papal protection. Whether every accusation was true is almost beside the point. What mattered was that people believed them, and that belief shaped behavior. By 1044, the city had reached a breaking point. The Romans revolted. They drove Benedict out and installed a rival pope, Sylvester III. For a moment, it looked like the people had reclaimed agency. But Benedict's family had money, and money buys armies. Within months, Benedict returned with hired troops, expelled Sylvester by force, and reclaimed the papacy. The message was unmistakable. The throne of Peter was not defended by sanctity. It was defended by swords. For ordinary believers, this was devastating. Imagine going to Mass not knowing whether the man named in the prayers would still be Pope by nightfall. Imagine trying to believe in divine order while armed men settled church leadership in the streets. But the story of Benedict IX does not stop there, because something remarkable and deeply revealing happened next. Benedict grew bored. He had tasted power and found it tiresome. The responsibilities chafed, the constant tension annoyed him, and more importantly, he wanted something the papacy forbade: marriage. So Benedict did what only a system already broken could allow. In 1045, he decided to sell the papacy. Not resign quietly, not abdicate for reform, sell. The buyer was his own godfather, John Gratian, a respected priest who believed, perhaps sincerely, that removing Benedict was worth the price. John Gratian paid a vast sum of money and became Pope Gregory VI. For the first time in recorded history, the papacy changed hands through an explicit financial transaction. Simony was no longer rumor. It was documented reality, and Rome barely reacted. That silence tells us everything, because when corruption becomes normalized, even sacrilege can pass without riot. Gregory VI attempted reform. He dismissed corrupt officials, restored order, and tried to govern responsibly. But the stain remained. Because Benedict IX had not disappeared. He had taken the money. And then, predictably, he wanted the throne back. Soon, Rome faced an absurdity that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. 3 men claimed to be pope at the same time. Benedict IX, asserting that his resignation was invalid because it involved simony. Gregory VI, who had purchased the office but now stood accused of corruption. Sylvester III, still refusing to relinquish his earlier claim. It was chaos dressed in vestments. The faithful were bewildered, foreign rulers were alarmed, and for the first time, the wider Christian world openly acknowledged that Rome could not fix itself. Enter Henry III of Germany. In 1046, Henry marched into Italy, not as conqueror, but as referee. He convened the Council of Sutri, summoned all 3 papal claimants, and did what Rome could not. He removed them all. Sylvester III was sent to a monastery. Gregory VI stepped down in disgrace. Benedict IX was excommunicated and expelled. Henry then appointed a German bishop as Pope Clement II, restoring order by force of external authority. This moment is crucial because it marks a shift. The papacy, supposedly the supreme spiritual authority, had been rescued by a secular ruler, not advised, not guided, rescued. For many believers, this was humiliating. But for reformers, it was clarifying. They saw, finally, that moral appeals were insufficient, that corruption embedded in structure required structural change. Benedict IX did not merely disgrace the papacy, he exposed its vulnerabilities. He demonstrated that when power becomes hereditary, accountability collapses. When offices can be bought, legitimacy dissolves. When holiness is optional, violence fills the vacuum. And yet, history is rarely neat. There are later accounts suggesting Benedict repented, that he retired to a monastery, that he died quietly, reflecting on his sins. Whether this is true or a comforting fiction, we cannot say. But repentance does not erase consequence. And the consequences of Benedict IX were immense. His chaos galvanized reform movements. It strengthened the resolve of those who would soon reshape the church, enforcing clerical celibacy, attacking simony, and reasserting spiritual discipline. The irony is sharp. One of the worst popes in history became the reason the papacy began to reform itself. But reform, when delayed too long, always arrives under pressure. And that pressure was building. Because the next phase of papal power would not be weak and dissolute, it would be confident, commanding, convinced that the Pope should rule kings. In the next part, we meet a man who believed exactly that. Boniface VIII, the Pope who tried to dominate Europe and learned painfully how far power could push back. Reform or ruin, when the Church turned on itself. After Benedict IX, something in the Church quietly broke. Not loudly, not in the streets, but in the conscience of those who still believed the institution could not survive another generation like this. Because Benedict's scandal was different. John XII had been young and reckless. Stephen VI had been vicious and unstable. But Benedict IX had done something far more corrosive. He had treated the papacy as a commodity. Once that happened, no amount of ceremony could disguise the truth anymore. If the throne of Peter could be bought, sold, reclaimed, and fought over like land or livestock, then the problem was no longer one man. It was the system itself. And systems do not repent. They reform, or they collapse. The response did not come first from Rome. It never does. Rome is too entangled in its own gravity, too accustomed to surviving scandals by absorbing them. The response came from monasteries, from men who had withdrawn from the noise of power and, in doing so, had preserved a memory of what the Church was supposed to be. One place in particular began to matter more than anyone expected: Cluny. Founded in 910 in what is now France, the Abbey of Cluny had been established with a radical idea for its time. It would answer directly to the Pope, not to local lords. At first, this seemed like a technical detail. In practice, it was revolutionary, because it removed monastic life from aristocratic control. Cluniac monks were not installed by nobles. They were not dependent on local families for survival. They lived under strict discipline, focused on prayer, learning, and moral integrity. And over time, they began to look at Rome with growing unease. Not because Rome was sinful, everyone already knew that, but because Rome had become structurally corrupt. Cluniac reformers believed that holiness could not exist where offices were sold, where clergy married into dynasties, and where bishops treated their sees as family property. They identified 3 cancers eating away at the Church: simony, the buying and selling of spiritual offices; Nicolaitism, clerical marriage and dynastic entanglement; lay investiture, secular rulers appointing church officials. These were not abstract theological issues. They were mechanisms of decay. Because once a bishop owes his position to a king or a family, he no longer answers to conscience. He answers to power. Cluny's influence spread slowly but relentlessly. Its monks became advisors. Its ideals became language. Its discipline became aspiration. By the mid-11th century, a generation of reform-minded churchmen, many trained in Cluniac environments, had begun to rise within the hierarchy itself. And for the first time in centuries, Rome felt pressure not from mobs or emperors, but from within. This is where the story turns. Because reform is never gentle. When institutions try to purge themselves, they uncover things long hidden. They provoke resistance. They split loyalties. And the papacy was about to become something new again. No longer weak, no longer controlled by families, but assertive, moral, and dangerously confident. The first sign of this shift came with a series of reformist popes appointed under imperial influence. Men who genuinely believed the church must be purified or it would lose its soul entirely. They attacked simony relentlessly. They enforced clerical celibacy. They stripped offices from hereditary claimants, and in doing so, they made enemies everywhere. Because reform threatens those who benefit from the old order. Nobles resented losing control over bishoprics. Clergy resented being told how to live. Kings resented being excluded from appointments they had long treated as political tools. And Rome itself, used to compromise, resented being lectured. But the reformers did not stop. They believed something essential had been revealed by the horrors of the previous century. That corruption at the top does not stay at the top. It flows downward. It teaches cynicism. It poisons faith. And worst of all, it makes people stop believing that holiness is even possible. Yet here is the irony. The very reforms meant to save the church would give rise to new dangers. Because once the papacy cleansed itself of dependency on families and kings, it discovered something intoxicating: independence. And independence can quickly turn into absolutism. If earlier popes had been too weak, too compromised, too indulgent, the next generation would be too strong. They would not beg kings. They would command them. They would not negotiate legitimacy. They would declare it. And at the center of this transformation stands one figure who embodies the triumph and the peril of reform. A man who believed utterly that the Pope was superior to every earthly ruler. A man who would issue one of the most dangerous sentences ever written by a pope. A sentence that claimed nothing less than universal submission. His name was Boniface VIII, and with him, the papacy would rise to a peak of power it had never known, just before beginning another long fall. In the next part, we move into the age where the Pope no longer hides behind families or emperors. He steps forward alone, crowned, defiant, certain that God himself stands behind every word he speaks, and the world will push back. Two thrones, one church, the night Europe split in half. There are moments in history when confusion becomes permanent. Not loud confusion, not the kind that sparks riots immediately. The quieter kind, the kind that settles into daily life. The kind where people wake up, go to work, attend Mass, and slowly realize that the world no longer agrees on who is in charge. That is what happened in 1378. For nearly 70 years before that moment, the papacy had not lived in Rome at all. It had lived in Avignon, a city effectively under French control. Popes spoke Latin, wore ancient symbols, and claimed universal authority, but everyone knew where the pressure came from. France paid the bills. France offered protection. France influenced decisions. To many Europeans, especially Italians, the papacy had become a hostage institution, and when the Avignon Pope died in 1378, Rome demanded change. The Roman people surrounded the conclave. They did not whisper. They shouted. They demanded an Italian pope, or else. Inside, the cardinals panicked. They were mostly French. They feared violence. They feared chaos. So they chose a compromise candidate, Bartolomeo Prignano, Archbishop of Bari, Italian by birth, but not Roman, not a cardinal, not part of the Avignon elite. He took the name Urban VI. At first, the choice seemed inspired. Urban was austere, serious, unimpressed by luxury. He spoke harshly to cardinals who lived comfortably while preaching poverty. He scolded them publicly. He talked about reform. And that, quietly, was the problem. Urban did not understand the psychology of power. He believed truth, once spoken, would be accepted. Instead, it terrified the people who had everything to lose. Urban did not flatter. He did not negotiate. He humiliated. And humiliation creates enemies faster than corruption ever does. Within weeks, the cardinals regretted their choice. Urban's temper flared. his moods shifted. He insulted them openly, threatened them, questioned their legitimacy. And soon, many feared not just for their status, but for their safety. So they fled. They regrouped. And then they made a decision that would fracture Christianity. They declared Urban's election invalid. They claimed it had been conducted under mob intimidation, and they elected a new pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Suddenly, Christendom had two popes. Both claimed legitimacy. Both excommunicated the other. Both appointed bishops. Both demanded obedience. And Europe had to choose. France sided with Avignon. England sided with Rome. Spain hesitated. Italy split. Families split. Monasteries split. Even saints disagreed. For ordinary believers, the question was unbearable. Which pope could forgive sins? Which mass counted? Which excommunication mattered? If salvation required obedience to the pope, which pope? Urban VI could have tried to heal the rupture. He did the opposite. As opposition hardened, Urban became paranoid, suspicious, vengeful. He surrounded himself with loyalists. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and sometimes they were real. In 1385, several cardinals, once loyal, began discussing an appeal to a general council. Not rebellion. Resolution. Urban discovered this, and something in him snapped. He ordered their arrest. Not quietly, publicly. They were imprisoned, interrogated, and according to multiple chroniclers, tortured. This is where Urban's reputation darkens permanently. Accounts claim he personally oversaw interrogations, that he complained when screams were not loud enough, that he believed terror was necessary to preserve authority. Some historians caution that these stories may be exaggerated, but here is the problem. They were believed, and belief shapes reality. Eventually, several cardinals were executed, princes of the church killed on papal orders. This was unprecedented. Even in the worst centuries, popes had murdered rivals discreetly. Urban did it openly. Europe recoiled. Yet the schism continued. Each pope crowned kings, blessed wars, collected taxes, issued indulgences, excommunicated enemies. It was no longer spiritual leadership. It was parallel bureaucracies of salvation. Urban's Rome became increasingly militarized. He involved himself in the violent politics of Naples. He launched campaigns against cities that supported Avignon. Armies marched under papal banners. Civilians suffered. Villages burned. All while two men claimed to represent the Prince of Peace. Urban died in 1389, possibly from injuries after falling from a mule, possibly poisoned. No one mourned deeply, but his death did not heal the wound. Rome elected another pope. Avignon did the same. The schism hardened into structure. By the early 15th century, the situation became absurd. A council attempted to end the crisis. Instead, it created a third pope. Now Christendom had three men claiming supreme authority, three courts, three colleges of cardinals, three versions of legitimacy, and no clear way out. Faith became political loyalty. Confession became uncertain. Obedience became regional. For common people, the church no longer felt like a guide. It felt like a battlefield. And slowly, quietly, something else began to happen. People began to ask a question that would echo into the future. If popes can disagree, if popes can curse each other, if popes can be wrong, Then what exactly makes a pope infallible? The schism would eventually end in 1417. A council would depose claimants, a single pope would be elected, unity would be restored, on paper. But something had been lost: trust. The image of an unbroken spiritual authority. The sense that Rome spoke with one voice. Urban VI did not cause the schism alone, but his temperament ensured it would become violent, bitter, and enduring. He stands as a reminder that reform without restraint can be just as destructive as corruption, and that sometimes the most dangerous popes are not the ones who sin openly, but the ones who believe absolutely that they cannot be wrong. In the next part, we step into the Renaissance, into velvet and poison, into art, intrigue, and spectacle, into a papal court so infamous that its name still means corruption today. The Borgias are waiting. The Borgias, when the papacy became a dynasty. By the time the 15th century gave way to the Renaissance, Rome had changed its costume. The scars of the schism were still there, but they were covered now with marble, frescoes, silk, and gold. The papacy had survived division. It had survived humiliation. And it had learned something dangerous in the process. If holiness no longer guaranteed obedience, spectacle might. Enter the age of the Renaissance Pope. And at the center of it stands one name that refuses to fade: Borgia. Even now, centuries later, the word itself feels heavy, thick with poison, ambition, and whispered scandal. But to understand Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, we have to resist the temptation of caricature. Because the truth is more unsettling than the legend. Rodrigo Borgia was not an accident. He was the logical outcome of everything that came before. He had been shaped by a church that had learned to survive by compromise, by politics, by power. Rodrigo rose through the ranks early, aided by family connections. His uncle had been Pope Calixtus III, but also by genuine administrative talent. He was intelligent, charismatic, an expert in canon law and diplomacy. For decades, he served as vice-chancellor of the church, effectively running its bureaucracy. He knew how the machine worked, and when the conclave of 1492 gathered, he used that knowledge ruthlessly. Money flowed. Offices were promised, votes were secured. Simony was illegal, but it was also normal. Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI. Almost immediately, he made a choice that shocked even a hardened Rome. He did not pretend to be celibate. He openly acknowledged his children: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, Joffre. They were not secrets, they were assets. Alexander did not see the papacy as a sacred trust temporarily held. He saw it as leverage, a platform to build something lasting, a dynasty. And in Renaissance Italy, dynasties were built with land, marriage, and blood. Alexander appointed his teenage son Cesare as a cardinal, not because Cesare was spiritual, but because it gave the family influence. Later, he released Cesare from holy orders altogether so he could become something more useful: a general, a prince, a weapon. With papal blessing, Cesare Borgia carved through central Italy. Cities fell. Rivals disappeared, all under the banner of church authority. The papacy was no longer just political, it was militarized, and Rome watched in awe and horror. Alexander's court became infamous: banquets, masquerades, feasts where clergy and nobles mingled with courtesans. The most notorious story, The Banquet of the Chestnuts, comes from the diary of Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. According to him, a private Vatican gathering devolved into a grotesque spectacle of nudity and sexual competition. Some historians question the details, but no one questions why the story was believed, because Alexander's reputation made it plausible. Rumors of poison followed the Borgias everywhere. A special toxin, cantarella, was whispered about. Cardinals with wealth were said to die suddenly after dining with the Pope. Their estates conveniently transferred to Borgia hands. One such case was Cardinal Orsini, arrested, imprisoned, and dead soon after. Official cause, illness. Unofficial verdict, murder. Whether every accusation was true matters less than the atmosphere they created. Fear, uncertainty, silence. To oppose the Borgias was to risk everything. Alexander's enemies often met theatrical ends. The most famous was Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar of Florence. Savonarola preached against corruption, against luxury, against Rome itself. He called the Vatican a new Babylon. For a time, he held Florence in his grip. Bonfires of vanities burned art, books, cosmetics. But Alexander could not tolerate a preacher who challenged papal authority publicly. Savonarola was excommunicated, arrested, tortured, and in 1498, hanged and burned. His ashes were thrown into the river so no relics could remain. It was a message. Moral reform would not be allowed to threaten power. Yet Alexander was not chaos incarnate. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. He was also effective. He stabilized the papal states, strengthened central authority, negotiated treaties. He even issued the papal bull that divided the newly discovered lands of the Americas between Spain and Portugal. With a pen, he drew lines across the globe, as if the world itself were his to allocate. To many contemporaries, this was proof of divine authority. To others, proof of staggering hubris. When Alexander died in 1503, Rome did not mourn. His body reportedly swelled grotesquely, turned dark, barely fit into its coffin. Onlookers whispered that God had finally spoken. Yet even his enemies admitted something unsettling. The Borgias had shown what the papacy could be when wielded without shame. A Renaissance principality, a war machine, a family empire. And that lesson would not be forgotten. The tragedy of Alexander VI is not that he was uniquely evil. It is that he was successful. He proved that the papacy could be used like any other throne. And once proven, that knowledge could not be unlearned. But the cost was immense. Faith eroded, trust collapsed. And far from Rome in the north, a young monk was watching, listening, taking notes. He would soon ask a question that Alexander never imagined would matter. What if the Pope himself is the problem? In the next part, indulgences will ring, coins will fall, and one sentence nailed to a church door will change Europe forever. Indulgences, enjoyment, and the spark that broke Christendom. By the time Pope Alexander VI was laid in the ground, swollen and blackened, Rome had learned nothing, or perhaps worse, it had learned the wrong lesson. The Borgias had shown that scandal did not destroy the papacy. Division had not destroyed it either. Violence, poison, and humiliation had come and gone, and still the throne of Peter stood. So the next generation of popes did not think in terms of repentance. They thought in terms of comfort. If power could survive corruption, why not enjoy it? That question found its most elegant and disastrous expression in Pope Leo X. Giovanni de' Medici, born into Florence's most powerful family, a cardinal at 13, a pope at 37. Leo X did not look like the villains who came before him. He was not cruel, not paranoid, not visibly depraved. He was charming, cultured, refined, a lover of music, theater, hunting, and art. He adored beauty, and he believed, sincerely, that beauty glorified God. But Leo had inherited something fragile, a church still bleeding from schism, a papacy burdened by debt, a Rome rebuilt in marble but hollow in spirit. And instead of tightening discipline, Leo did what he knew best. He spent lavishly, endlessly. Festivals filled the Vatican, plays, masks, banquets. Poets and artists were paid handsomely. Raphael worked under his patronage. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica accelerated. Rome gleamed again, but the treasury emptied. Leo's court ran on borrowed money. Offices were sold quietly, favors exchanged, and then, more openly, indulgences were expanded. Indulgences had existed for centuries. In theory, they reduced the temporal punishment for sins already forgiven through confession. They were meant to encourage piety, prayer, pilgrimage, charitable works. But under Leo X, indulgences became something else, a revenue stream. In 1517, Leo authorized a massive indulgence campaign to fund St. Peter's Basilica. The arrangement was complex. German churchmen needed money to repay debts owed to Rome. Rome needed money to finish its cathedral. Everyone needed money. So preachers were sent out. Men trained not in theology, but persuasion. The most famous was Johann Tetzel. Tetzel traveled through German lands, preaching a message that horrified many listeners. When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was catchy, simple, and devastating. Salvation, once framed as repentance and grace, now sounded transactional. Coins for souls, money for mercy. To many peasants, this was hope. To many scholars, it was blasphemy. One of those scholars was an Augustinian monk in Wittenberg, Martin Luther. Luther was not trying to destroy the church. At first, he wanted debate, clarification, reform. He had visited Rome earlier in his life and returned shaken. He had seen priests rush through Mass, church offices treated as careers, pilgrims mocked, devotion hollow. Now, watching indulgent sellers prey on fear, something broke. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed, or at least sent, a list of propositions to his bishop. 95 statements. Questions, really, about repentance, about authority, about whether the Pope truly had power over purgatory. The printing press did the rest. Within weeks, Luther's ideas spread across Germany. Within months, across Europe. Rome was slow to react. Leo X reportedly dismissed Luther as a noisy monk, a minor irritation. He was more concerned with hunting parties and performances. There is a line attributed to Leo, likely apocryphal, but revealing in its popularity. Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. Whether he said it or not, people believed he did. And belief mattered. As Luther's challenge grew, Leo responded not with reform, but with authority, excommunication, condemnation, demands for recantation. But something had changed. For the first time, large numbers of people did not care. Princes protected Luther. Cities embraced reform. Money stopped flowing to Rome. What had begun as a financial scheme became a theological earthquake, and Leo had no tools to stop it, because the moral authority needed to silence critics had been spent long before. On banquets, on elephants gifted from Portugal, on art that dazzled the eye but could not calm the conscience. Leo died in 1521, broke, surrounded by unpaid debts. Rome's creditors rushed the Vatican. The treasury was empty, but the damage was far larger. Western Christendom was breaking apart, not over doctrine alone, but over trust. The sense that Rome spoke for God had been replaced by suspicion, by anger, by the belief that the papacy had become something else entirely. In Catholic lands, Leo was remembered as irresponsible. In Protestant lands, he became a symbol, the pleasure pope, the man who sold salvation, the Antichrist in silk. Yet here is the quiet tragedy. Leo X did not intend to shatter the church. He simply failed to understand the moment. He believed scandal could be outgrown, that indulgence could be managed, that criticism would fade. Instead, he presided over the point of no return. After him, Europe would never worship together again, and the papacy would face something it had never truly confronted before: a world where obedience was optional. In the next and final part, we arrive at the collapse point: a pope trapped in a fortress, Rome in flames, and the moment when even Catholics wondered whether God himself had turned away. The sack of Rome is coming, the sack of Rome, when God fell silent. There are moments when history feels less like a story and more like a reckoning. The sack of Rome in 1527 was one of those moments. Not because it was unprecedented, Rome had been sacked before, but because of who watched it happen. This time, the city burned while the Pope hid, and the world noticed. By the time Pope Clement VII took the throne in 1523, the papacy was already standing on cracked ground. The Reformation was spreading, Germany was fracturing, England was restless, Rome was politically entangled, financially weak, and morally compromised. Clement, born Giulio de' Medici, was intelligent, cautious, and deeply political. He was not a monster like John XII, not a tyrant like Urban VI, not a libertine like Alexander VI. In some ways, that made him more dangerous, because Clement believed he could manage chaos. He tried to balance Europe's two great powers, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and Francis I of France, by playing them against each other. It was a familiar papal strategy, and it failed catastrophically. After Charles V defeated Francis I in 1525, Clement panicked. A single emperor now dominated Europe, and Rome feared becoming irrelevant, or worse, controlled. So Clement switched sides. He joined the League of Cognac, aligning with France and Italian states against Charles. It was a gamble, and Rome lost. Charles's armies marched south in 1527, unpaid, angry, and filled with mercenaries, many of them German Lutherans who despised the Catholic Church. They did not see Rome as sacred. They saw it as rich. On May 6, 1527, they breached the walls. What followed was 8 days of horror: churches looted, altars smashed, relics stolen or destroyed, priests murdered, nuns violated, citizens tortured for hidden wealth. The streets ran with blood. Rome's population collapsed, tens of thousands dead, enslaved, or fled. And where was the Pope? Inside Castel Sant'Angelo. Clement fled through the secret corridor linking the Vatican to the fortress, while 147 Swiss guards died on the steps of St. Peter's buying him time. Those guards are still remembered today. The Pope is remembered for something else: watching, waiting, surviving. For months, Clement remained trapped in the fortress, growing a beard in penitence, listening to the city rot beneath him. Plague followed the sack. Bodies lay unburied. Families disappeared. The spiritual capital of Christianity had become a wasteland. To Catholics, it felt like punishment. To Protestants, confirmation. To everyone else, an unmistakable message. The Pope could not protect Rome. The illusion was shattered. Eventually, Clement surrendered. He paid ransom. He ceded territory. He bowed to Charles V, literally crowning the man whose soldiers had destroyed Rome. And then came Clement's second failure, Henry VIII. The English king wanted an annulment. Clement hesitated, feared angering Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, stalled, delayed, refused. England broke away. An entire kingdom lost. Not because of theology alone, but because Clement was politically trapped by the very power games popes had been playing for centuries. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Clement VII was not evil in the theatrical sense. He did not poison rivals. He did not sell the papacy. He did not indulge in public vice. But under his watch, Rome was destroyed. Europe fractured further. England left Catholicism. Millions would die in the religious wars that followed, and Clement survived it all. This raises the most unsettling question of the entire series. What does it mean when the worst damage is caused not by monsters, but by cautious men protecting institutions? Because the sack of Rome did not end the papacy, it transformed it. After 1527, popes no longer claimed universal political supremacy with the same confidence. The Counter-Reformation began. Discipline tightened. Corruption was confronted, at least publicly, but something else had changed forever. The papacy was no longer untouchable. People had seen a pope imprisoned, a holy city violated, the church divided beyond repair. And once seen, it could not be unseen. So were these popes evil? Some were cruel, some were corrupt, some were reckless. But the deeper pattern is this: when spiritual authority becomes indistinguishable from power, it attracts the wrong instincts. Fear, control, dynasty, survival. The Cadaver Synod showed what happens when vengeance replaces reverence. The Pornocracy showed what happens when families replace faith. The Borgias showed what happens when the papacy becomes a throne. Leo X showed what happens when comfort replaces conscience. Clement VII showed what happens when politics consumes the soul. And the sack of Rome showed the final truth: that no institution, no matter how sacred, can outrun its own contradictions forever. The people who suffered most were not kings or cardinals. They were ordinary believers, citizens, peasants, families. Those who trusted that someone, somewhere, was guarding the sacred. History did not end the papacy, but it stripped away its illusion of innocence. And perhaps that is the most controversial conclusion of all. Not that the church was corrupt, but that it survived corruption by becoming something else entirely. More cautious, more defensive, less divine in its claims, and more human than it ever wanted to admit. That is where this story ends. Not with judgment, but with silence. The kind that follows when even heaven seems to pause, and history keeps going anyway. And so, as the lights dim over Rome, the echoes of these centuries do not end with a verdict. No thunder from the heavens, no final condemnation. Just stone streets, still warm from history, and questions left unanswered. These popes, some cruel, some reckless, some simply overwhelmed, were not monsters in the way legends prefer. They were men placed inside an institution that promised holiness while demanding power. And power, when mixed with certainty, has a way of bending even sacred intentions. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that the papacy fell so low, but that it endured. Through scandal, through division, through blood and fire. Endurance does not always mean virtue. Sometimes it only means adaptation. And for the ordinary people of these centuries, the pilgrims, the monks, the mothers lighting candles in ruined churches, the question was never who was right. It was simply, who can I trust tonight? As you rest now, let these stories settle quietly, like dust on ancient marble. Not as accusations, but as reminders that institutions are human, that faith can survive even when its guardians fail, and that history, like sleep, has a way of softening even the darkest truths with time. Thank you for spending this hour with us. This has been Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Good night.